Planet Earth is made up of around 180,000 islands. Now some of these are huge and make up countries, but others are tiny and unpopulated, and it's usually these ones that most of us have never heard about that hold some seriously dark stories and unsolved mysteries that are still unexplained to this day. Such as one that saw a ridiculous amount of cannibalism that has rarely been talked about, to another that literally vanished from the face of the planet. Here are 5 uninhabited islands with mysterious and dark histories. Bouvet Island. At first glance, there doesn't seem to be anything special about Bouvet, apart from the fact that it's the most remote island on the planet. It's located in the South Atlantic Ocean in the freezing sub-Antarctic, and you probably wouldn't even see it on a map, but it holds a very interesting secret. The island was discovered by Jean-Baptiste Bouvet de Lauze in 1739, and after its discovery it was mostly forgotten about due to Bouvet fixing its position incorrectly, so basically no one, not even the famous British explorer Captain Cook, could find it. It was not logged again for over 100 years when a German survey ship came across it in 1898 and calculated that it was around 5 miles long and 3 miles wide, and 90% of its surface was covered with ice. After this, there were very few visits there from other explorers, and in this time an underwater volcano had erupted, slightly increasing the size of the island. But then in 1964, when South Africa dropped a survey team there by helicopter, British Lieutenant Commander Alan Crawford made an unexpected discovery. In a small lagoon amongst a colony of seals was an abandoned boat. The boat was in relatively good condition and had no markings or clues to its nationality. The crew that spotted it first thought that it must be a lifeboat from a larger ship, but with no ships ever coming within 1,000 miles of the island, what ship would it have come from? They came to the conclusion that if it was a lifeboat, there was no way it could have survived the treacherous icy waters surrounding the island and would have been smashed to pieces. Unfortunately, a thorough search of the island was not possible due to time constrictions, but Crawford did manage to take this photograph to confirm what he saw. Sadly it seems though, apart from Crawford, no one was overly concerned about the discovery, and apart from his brief statement on what he found, no one has offered any explanation as to why no research was done on the origin of this mysterious boat. But judging by its position, it indicated that it purposely landed and its crew reached the shore. Crawford backs this theory by saying he also saw a small pile of wood, a set of oars and a copper buoyancy tank that had been opened out flat a few meters from the boat. So what happened? Maybe someone did make it to the most remote island on Earth in the small boat and explored around, but got lost and were killed by an avalanche or starved to death. Maybe it did just get washed up unmanned, although if Crawford's sighting of the pile of wood and the flotation tank are true, and the fact, like I said, the boat was undamaged, then this seems very unlikely. But there is more to this story. Lieutenant Crawford claims that while he was working in Cape Town in 1959, 5 years before the boat was discovered, he had a visit from an Italian count who asked him for advice about chartering a ship to Bouvet. Apparently it was so the respected professor Silvio Zavati could conduct scientific research there. Well, Crawford did what he could to help, but was unable to find a vessel suitable for the harsh water around the island. However, a year later, he received a letter from Professor Zavati claiming he had made it to Bouvet the previous year. But when the Italian count was asked about the trip, he denied it took place and said Zavati was making it up. So, did that trip happen or not? In 1959, the same year the Italian count was asking about making a trip there, a Soviet expedition made it to Bouvet, but they made no mention of the abandoned boat in their journals. Since Bouvet is the most remote island in the world, and very few if any trips are taking place there, we'll always be left with the mystery of that boat. Is it still there? And if so, how did it get there in the first place? Henderson Island. Henderson Island lies in the eastern Pacific Ocean and has been practically untouched due to its lack of fresh water that makes it unsuitable for human habitation. Now, there is some evidence from ancient history that suggests the island was inhabited by a Polynesian settlement, possibly between the 12th and 15th century, but the reason for their disappearance is unknown. While in 1820, a year after the island was rediscovered and named by Captain Henderson, the Essex, a Nantucket whale ship, was rammed by a vengeful 80-ton sperm whale, and slowly sank, leaving the crew stranded in 3 small whaleboats. Now, I'm not going into the full story of their cannibalism and their fate because I've talked about it in a previous video and in an article on the site, but the 19 surviving crew found themselves on Henderson Island, and after 16 of them left shortly after, 3 were left to fend for themselves there. When they were finally rescued on the 9th of April 1821, they said they had come across between 6 and 8 human bones on Henderson Island. It's likely they were the remains of shipwrecked mariners who perished due to the lack of water and food. However, this was not the first time skeletons had been found. It was reported in 1851 and 1858 that skeletons were discovered in caves at Henderson. Now, it's unclear if these were the same skeletons as the Essex crew found, but the 1858 discovery definitely was not, because these were 4 perfectly formed human skeletons lying next to each other, with their hands by their side, 3 adults and a child. When a second expedition was sent to the cave, the group ventured further into it and found a mound of coral sand. As they dug into the mound, they unearthed 2 additional skeletons, one with a tuft of hair still attached to its skull. The tuft of hair was the only thing removed, and after examination, it was confirmed as human. The skeletons were not visited again until the US Air Force surveyed the island in 1966, and they were placed in caskets and buried in the cave. In 1991, some were dug up and removed for proper examination, and it was concluded they belonged to prehistoric Polynesians. What's fascinating is we know very little about their way of life there, and have no records for how many years they were calling Henderson Island their home. Bermeja Island. What would you say if I told you that a tiny, uninhabited island that used to sit to the northwest of the Yucatan Peninsula in the Gulf of Mexico completely disappeared in 1921? It was featured in an edition of the Geographic Atlas and had very precise coordinates and descriptions, just like any other small island. So what happened? Well, the simplest explanation would be that it was a victim of global warming and rising sea levels. But if this were true, there would still be some remnant of the island left, at least deep underwater. But despite investigations, there is no evidence that this is what happened, and it's like the island has completely vanished. Another theory is that the island was a casualty of an underwater earthquake that knocked it into oblivion. But there is a more interesting and widely believed theory, and that is that the US blew it up. It does sound a bit far-fetched at first, but there would be a very good reason for them doing so: oil. The island was a strategic marker defining Mexican and US maritime and subsea rights, and was the official land point from where Mexico set its 200-mile nautical economic zone. By eliminating the island, the United States would get the upper hand in Hoyos de Nona area, which is rich with oil reserves. With the disappearance of Bermeja, the land point is now measured from the Alacranes Island, which dramatically reduces Mexico's economic zone, giving the US a bigger share. In recent years, the Mexican authorities have carried out investigations and said this: a force of nature able to sink an island does not take place without anyone noticing, and much less so when it's sitting in an area with more than 22 billion barrels of oil reserves. So is this credible or just a conspiracy theory? Could it be that the island never existed in the first place and was mapped incorrectly by early explorers with inaccurate navigational systems, or was it really blown up by the US to obtain more oil? One thing's for sure, we're certainly not getting any closer to solving Bermeja Island's apparent disappearance. And there are a surprising amount of these cases where islands have just randomly vanished without explanation, and you can be sure that I will be talking about them in a future video. Tiburon Island. Tiburon Island is the largest island in Mexico. It's barren and extremely difficult to get to due to strong tidal currents, but was once the home to members of the Seri people. Currently it's uninhabited, although there are still military encampments on the east and south coast. But what's interesting about Tiburon is it's had its fair share of tales, from huge gold deposits being there to mysterious disappearances linked to the Seri natives' cannibalism, which is what I'm going to talk about. Let's start with Ariel Robinson, an American newspaperman and novelist who decided to visit the island in 1894, intending to stay for 6 months to study the Seri natives. For some reason, before he left, he told a fellow press correspondent that he wanted to be declared dead by the newspaper, so it looked as if the natives had killed him. We are not sure why he did this, but he never returned from the island and is believed to have been bombarded with stones and arrows when he arrived. A couple of years after this, Captain George Porter, a natural history explorer, also ventured to the island to collect seashells. But when he failed to return, the Mexican army searched the island for him and remnants of his camp and shoes were found, but nothing else. The Mexicans reported that Porter had most likely been killed and cooked on a fire made from his own boat. Then, a few years later, as the island gained a reputation for cannibalism, a military campaign was launched to clear the island of all its inhabitants, although a small number of Seri people remained there until around 1920. Probably the most well-known and tragic incident at Tiburon Island, though, was the Grindle expedition led by Thomas Grindle. He had visited the island before and befriended the Seri people, but his second trip in June 1905 with 4 other men did not go as peacefully as the first. The team did not bring enough provisions and eventually found themselves lost, so split up in an attempt to survive. One man did make it back to safety over 4 months later, but when there was no sign of the other men, Thomas Grindle's brother Edward sent out a search party. During their search of the island, they made a shocking discovery. They found white hands that had been nailed to a stake that were surrounded by dance rings and remnants of cameras scattered nearby. It was obvious to the search crew that it was the 4 missing men, but Edward refused to believe this gruesome discovery was his brother's party and continued to search. By this time, the one man who made it out alive was now helping with the search, and they eventually came across remnants of camps and the bodies of pack horses, leading Edward to believe his brother was still alive and was somewhere on the island. A couple of years later, Thomas Grindle's body was finally found by other explorers, along with the 3 other members of the party. Their heap of bleached bones were discovered in the burning heat of the desert, along with unreadable letters that were written by Thomas. The final statement is that they were not eaten by the Surrey natives, but would have been battling to survive for months. Where the mystery now lies is, who did those hands belong to that were nailed to the stake, and what happened to them? And to this day, that continues to be Tiburon Island's biggest unsolved mystery. Nazina. Nazina, also called Cannibal or Death Island, is a small isolated plot located in western Siberia, and as you can imagine with a nickname like that, it has a very dark past that has been kept a secret for many years. The island's history dates back to 1933, when the then leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, longed for a perfect, pure state. He had no time for people who did not fit his perfect image, and he deemed them unfit for his vision for his land. So he came up with the idea of banishing all the people he considered undesirables to an obscure, isolated and uninhabited island, Nazino. After rounding up 25,000 disabled, unemployed and homeless people, they were shipped to Tomska, where 6,200 of them were chosen to start a new life on Nazino Island. They were sent there with no tools, shelter, clothes or food, and the only thing they were given was flour. Before they even reached the island, 27 of them had died during the journey, and a further 300 died the first night, unable to survive the freezing temperatures. The ones that were left attempted to mix their flour with dirty river water, which caused terrible diarrhea and sickness. In desperation, some of them tried to escape on makeshift rafts, but were either gunned down by guards or drowned to death. The island became littered with dead bodies and reports of cannibalism were rife. The starving masses had no choice but to feast on the dead, ripping out their organs to stay alive, and it wasn't long before people were being murdered to be eaten. The whole experience got out of control, and despite the place being guarded by soldiers, they were powerless to prevent the savagery of the starving people, but still, more were being sent there. Finally, after just a month, the government began to realise the seriousness of the situation and reinforcements were sent in. Dozens were arrested for cannibalism, and in that short time, 4,000 of the original 6,000 or so people were dead. There was no official investigation into what had happened, and it was all kept a secret. It wasn't until 1988 that the truth started to emerge, when a Russian historical civil rights society tracked down suppressed documents about the event, to which nothing was made public until 2002. But even still, we do not know the full story of what happened on that island, and I can't even begin to imagine what it must have been like. It just makes you wonder that if something as barbaric as this took so long to be exposed, what else might have happened over the years that we have yet to find out about. So there's 5 islands with very mysterious and dark pasts. I hope you've enjoyed, and as always, I will see you next week for another video.